Alright guys, so we're gonna go back to Thomas Sowell. This is Pablo J. Ruiz with a P Alpha Reacts. Make sure that you like and subscribe. We're going back to the basis. We're going back to Thomas Sowell. Let's get into it. Make sure you like and subscribe again. We get into the 1,000 subscribers. We're almost there. Gonna really appreciate it. The rise of Scotland and Japan contrast to Black America. Thomas Sowell. Okay. Okay.
As far back as Roman times, Scotland lagged behind England, and as late as the 14th century, there was said to be no Scottish baron who could write his own name. Scottish agriculture was primitive, and its industry virtually non-existent. The people were illiterate, and there was no law and order, except for the arbitrary edicts of local clan chiefs. The largest city in Scotland in the 17th century, Edinburgh, had a population of just 16,000. Part of the reason for Scotland's lag behind England was geographic isolation. Scotland was on the outer fringes of European civilization. England was closer to continental Europe, which was for centuries more advanced than the British Isles, so that cultural artifacts of a more advanced civilization found their way across the Channel to the English. But whatever the reasons, the Scots lagged behind the English, and were painfully aware of that fact. After centuries of conflict, the English invaded Scotland, first the lowlands and then the highlands. They conquered Scotland both militarily and culturally. Scots were conscious to a painful degree of their backwardness, their poverty, their lack of polish, their provinciality. Scots began to speak English, usually with a heavy accent. A society for promoting the reading and speaking of the English language was formed, and lectures on the subject drew hundreds, including James Boswell. Even such an intellectual giant as David Hume took lessons in English pronunciation, and he warned fellow Scots against using peculiarly Scottish expressions, a warning repeated both in his letters and in Scots Magazine. James Mill deliberately purged his speech of Scottish pronunciation and expressions. He moved to England.
So why in the 17th century Scotland was not developed? That's kind of weird.
And raised John Stuart Mill and his other children as Englishmen.
The rest of Europe was
never
basically.
Heard him speak of Scotland, nor was he unique. Demeaning or not, the overwhelming desire to pass as English and to transcend Scottish origins was symbolic of the more pervasive fertilization of Scottish life with external influences. It eventually facilitated the universalization of Scottish scholarship, which was the hallmark of the Enlightenment and the outreach of its own culture.
Interesting.
Back in Scotland, Lowland Scots copied the English, and Highland Scots copied the Lowland Scots. Scottish farmers even used an English plow that was completely unsuitable for the soil of Scotland. In short, 18th century Scots represented a clear example of the cultural cringe. What was the result? First of all, the spread of the English language, beginning in the Scottish lowlands, opened a whole new world of literature in numerous fields to the Scots, fields in which there was little or no literature in the indigenous Gaelic language. Education caught on so widely in the Scottish lowlands that they had compulsory education before England did, and developed the most extensive system of schools in Europe. Not only an educated class, but an intellectual class developed in Scotland. As a distinguished historian put it, in every branch of knowledge, this once poor and ignorant people produced original and successful thinkers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
From the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, most of the leading British intellectual figures were either from Scotland or of Scottish ancestry.
Interesting.
These included David Hume in philosophy, Adam Smith in economics, Joseph Black in chemistry, Robert Adam in architecture, James Watt in engineering, Sir Walter Scott in literature, and John Stuart Mill in economics, philosophy, and political science. In medicine, Scots likewise moved to the forefront, not only in Britain, but also in Russia, where Catherine the Great had a Scottish physician, and in America, where Scots established some of the earliest medical schools. Scots also set the world standard in engineering in general and shipbuilding in particular. By 1871, nearly half the ships built in Great Britain were built in Scotland. Scottish universities surged ahead of English universities in science and engineering. In short, The Scots eventually surpassed those from whom they had once learned.
Interesting. So they basically, what they did was, let me see, man, over here, yeah. So basically, what they did was took that culture from the English and they optimized it, where they can now establish themselves as a society. Where are you going? Where are you going with this,
The
Thomas?
isolation which has often kept some societies lagging far behind others was a self-imposed isolation for Japan. From 1638 to 1868, emigration from Japan was forbidden on pain of death, and foreigners and foreign trade and foreign cultures were kept out. In short, Japan was one of the most self-insulated countries in history and
Interesting.
was also very poor and backward. This era ended dramatically when American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry entered Japanese waters in 1854 and demanded that Japan open its ports to the outside world. Helpless in the face of such overwhelming modern force, Japan had no choice but to submit to this demand. It was a turning point in the country's history. This
I was
painful
doing like a
demonstration of
Last
Japan's
Samurai kind of
weakness
thing.
and backwardness before its own people and before the world set in motion internal reforms and an agenda for national development that dominated the country's history for the next century. Japan's leaders in that era held up the West in general, and the United States in particular, as examples to be emulated. Western technology was imported, and Japanese students were sent to study in the West. The English language began to be taught in Japanese schools, and there was even a suggestion at one point that English be made the national language of Japan.
Oh, wow.
Textbooks issued by the Japanese government
Wow.
held up Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Franklin as models for the young to imitate,
Wow.
even more so than Japanese heroes. There were euphoric descriptions.
Yeah, that's where I had to. I understand it's American. You should be proud of that, right? But they Japanese, they have to just have their own, right? Where they can feel proud of their own people. That's the only thing, right? I know we wanted to expand our influence through the world, but damn, slow down, right?
Descriptions of the United States as an earthly paradise. It would be hard to find a more striking example of the cultural cringe than 19th century Japan. An episode shortly after Americans forced Japan to open up to the outside world illustrates the situation at that time.
Wow.
Commodore Perry presented a train as a gift, and the Americans proceeded to demonstrate it. At first, the Japanese watched the train fearfully from a safe distance, and when the engine began to move, they uttered cries of astonishment and drew in their breath. Before long, they were inspecting it closely, stroking it, and riding on it, and they kept this up throughout the day.
That was basically yesterday.
No one could have predicted then that a century later,
Look at that.
Japan would produce its own bullet train that
Look at
surpassed
that.
anything available in the United States. But it happened only
And this is where I get mad. Look at those trains, man. I just think about New York City, man. Those trains. The A train, the E train. The 2 and 6. Oh, man. The MTA, they have more money than Japan. And their train systems suck. And they have less money. Look at what they do. See, because they have pride. They have pride. See, in those big cities, we don't have pride. I live in Milwaukee, the same problem. There's no pride over here. These people have pride.
Because the Japanese recognized their own initial backwardness and were determined to overcome it. They began by learning all that they could from the West and emulating the West until they reached the point when they had amassed the knowledge, skill, and experience to take their own independent direction. In the first half of the 20th century, Japanese products were widely known as cheap, inferior imitations of European or American products. Even after Japan later began to produce higher quality products, such as cameras, the first Canon was an imitation of the German Leica, and the first Nikon was an imitation of its German rival, the Contax. Over time, however, these and other Japanese cameras evolved into the leading cameras in the world, both technologically and in terms of sales. Similarly spectacular developments occurred when the Japanese entered the electronics, automotive, and other fields.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Oh, man. It's gonna be... This is gonna be bad. I have a feeling.
Against the background of the history of Scotland and Japan, today's assumptions about the effects of pride and self-hate as factors in progress are hard to sustain. Against the history of blacks in the United States, many other assumptions are equally hard to sustain.
Is that Macron or something?
The history of the black population of the United States might be summed up in broad outlines as follows. Sold into slavery by African leaders, at a time when slavery was widely accepted in all civilizations, blacks entered a particular segment of American society and culture at the bottom, acquiring only the rudiments of Western civilization, not including literacy in most cases, and a way of life influenced by a peculiar redneck culture. Freed after the Civil War, but poverty-stricken, illiterate, unskilled, and unacculturated to the demanding way of life in a free republic with a market economy, blacks began their history as a free people at the bottom of American society. One sign of their lack of preparation for life as a free people was a rate of mortality among blacks in the aftermath of emancipation that was greater than it had been under slavery. This was just one sign of a more general lag in adjusting to the norms of the society around them. The small enclaves of New England culture transplanted among blacks via Oberlin College and Dunbar High School, as well as in black colleges established in the South by New Englanders, did not promote pride in the existing black redneck culture. On the contrary, the clear message in these enclaves was that the way most blacks talked, the way they behaved, and the whole set of redneck values they inherited were all wrong and were things to be overcome. The wholly disproportionate number of black leaders and high achievers who came out of these small enclaves is further evidence in the case of pride versus self-hate.
So, there was no pride. But when you think about it, I don't... It's a hard one. It's a hard one because when you compare it to Scotland, Japan, I mean, they were doing very good until the 1960s. 1960, everything went down to hell. Pride was taken out. Bro, he's saying that pride was not a main thing. Or am I listening wrong? I don't know. Let me know in the comment section, guys.
Among both blacks and white liberals, there were those who thought that cultural changes among blacks were unnecessary, that there could be progress without internal cultural change, effects without causes. In the post-1960s world, such views gained the ascendancy, and those who held these views often wondered why it was so hard to raise ghetto blacks out of poverty and social disintegration.
Interesting.
Their answer was usually a call for more welfare state programs, more pride and self-esteem, more steeping in the history of black achievement or white injustice. The actual track record of this approach, compared to the opposite approach in the New England enclaves, received virtually no attention. Fortunately, in the decades before this mindset became fixed, most blacks had
probably have some Native American thing going on.
Had lifted themselves out of poverty at a rate higher than that after the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. For example, more blacks rose into professional and other higher-level occupations in the years preceding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than in the years following its enactment. This factual history served no one's political agenda and has since been replaced by a fictional history that does. The economic advancement of blacks has been widely portrayed as due to the civil rights movement and to political leaders.
And that's where we come back to it. The civil rights movement. That civil rights movement. A lot of people, based on what I'm watching around and reading around, they infiltrated those movements to achieve all the things. I'm just saying. I might be wrong.
Black and white, who have proclaimed themselves champions of black Americans. Since no one has as large a vested interest in opposing this view as its proponents have in perpetuating it, the politically more convenient view has prevailed, along with attributing the continuing economic and social gaps between blacks and whites to the sins and shortcomings of the latter. Nothing is easier to find than sins and shortcomings among human beings, regardless of their race. The question is, how much of a causal factor these moral failings have been in history,
Yeah,
and to
that's a
what
great question.
extent have they been effects rather than causes? For example, the decline in whites' hostility and discrimination toward blacks in northern cities during the 19th century, followed by a resurgence of hostility at the turn of the century, were not just inexplicable swings of the pendulum in white public opinion. The masses of blacks arriving in the North at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century were denounced in the black newspapers of the time for their crudeness, violence, and crime.
Good
It
point.
was not just a question of perceptions or stereotypes among whites, though undoubtedly some whites reacted in ways wholly unjustified by the situation, as elements of other racial groups do.
Yeah.
Contemporary preoccupation with the evils of society distorts the history of many groups, passing over internal improvements that took decades or generations of effort, because those improvements, whether modest or dramatic, imply that there was something that needed to be improved within these groups, that not all their problems were
Okay.
due to the perceptions or stereotypes of others. Clinging to a counterproductive culture in the name of
Okay.
group pride.
So hip hop traveled to the UK. I guess the same time that was built in the United States. 40 years, basically. We're talking about since the 1980s all the way to 2022. And there's some weird stuff in hip hop right now. So
And avoiding changes because they could be labeled self-hate are patterns that have no track record that would justify optimism. The evidence is all on the other side, but that matters only to those who value evidence over ideology,
yep.
history over visions.
Shout out to Thomas Sowell TV. Very good, like always. Man, the case of the United States is very interesting because there was a clear in the black culture. There was a clear indication that they were doing very good until the 1960s. 1960, it seems like it was the pinnacle of the progress. But right now, I don't know what we have. I would say everything's going crazy, but when it comes to that particular culture, going backwards. Going backwards. I mean, it's the community with the highest babies out of wedlock. And that is not good because, again, a female, a woman cannot teach a child, a boy, how to be a man, so she will impose in the guy's spirit. So the guy is going to transform into rebel and nasty, furious, anger. And it's going to take that energy, which is a masculine energy, and just use it in a lot of very bad things. And the only male figure he has is the gangster, the guy that is always in front of the bodega. And the thing is that the mom would like to choose those type of guys too. So it's like it's a complete cycle, man. And there has to. The only way we can fix this is not government intervention. It's a conscious. It's a conscious shift. And I think some generations need to be sacrificed. Metaphorically, I'm saying like some generations need to go through the pain, and then while the others just catch up on they catch up to it, and then we can have a conversation. And listen, I go to a lot of these conversations with a lot of YouTubers. I'm not gonna say their name here, where these conversations are very, very raw. I'm talking about raw conversation, raw. They talk about race realism and all these things, and both to all sides, man. Hispanic, Latinos, Latinos, Asians, Jewish, white, black. They all talk about that realism, and you have to just be, thick enough to just sit down and listen to. and you'll be surprised. You'll be surprised how the community feels about a lot of things. When I heard it, I was like, wow. Also, so the community feel like this. The community wants this. The community want these things. They really do. Shout out to Thomas Sowell. Great video. The rise of Scotland and Japan contracts to Black America. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I always like and subscribe and share. I'm out.